Good morning and good evening to all participants, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on this first U.S.-Taiwan bilateral workshop on climate education. The workshop includes two sessions. It is session 1 today. We will present an overview of climate education in the U.S. and in Taiwan. I am Hwong-Wen. I teach at Graduate Institute of Environmental Engineering, National Taiwan-U.S. It is my pleasure to be the moderator today. Before we proceed, let me introduce the two organizers of the workshop. Could you advance to the next slide? Yes, the two organizers, one is National Taiwan University and the other is Global Environmental Education Partnership. And NTU, or National Taiwan University, was founded in 1928. It's the oldest, biggest, and the top university in Taiwan. It has 11 colleges with 54 departments and 108 institutes, including 33,000 students. It is now in charge of the National Education Program for Climate Change. The program started in 2012, supported by Taiwan Ministry of Education, to integrate teaching and research resources and cultivate educators to build capacity to confront the grand challenge of climate change. And the Global Environmental Education Partnership, or GEP, was launched by the US EPA, Taiwan EPA, and the North American Association for Environmental Education. GEP is a learning network designed to share effective practice, build leadership, and strengthen the practice of environmental education to address large-scale sustainability challenges, including climate change. So you are invited to visit the website, thegeep.org, to learn more. So about the workshop, the purpose of the workshop is to come to an understanding of climate education at both sides, the US and Taiwan, building capacity for teaching, and then create a new paradigm for knowledge, from knowledge to action. So next slide, please. Okay, so we will have two speeches today, about 15 minutes each. And all the participants are welcome to interact and discuss with the speakers by submitting questions through the question form in the, I think it is question bar as shown here. Okay. Okay, so next slide. So here comes our first speaker, Professor Ching-Pin, Professor Tung. And Professor Tung is now a professor at the Bioenvironmental System Engineering Department, National Taiwan University. His field of interest includes climate change, system analysis, and also sustainable soil and water resources. He is currently serving as the co-PI for the Education for Climate Change program. He's also the director of the Office of University Social Responsibility at National Taiwan University. Okay, so I'll hand the time over to Professor Tung. Let's welcome Professor Tung.
Okay. Okay, show my screen. It is my pleasure. Could you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. It is my pleasure to give a talk Today I'm going to introduce the Taiwan Climate Change Teaching Alliance. And this project is funded by the Ministry of Education. And many professors join this project. I just represent them to give a talk today. So this is the content I will let you know this, in this talk. I will give you briefly background of why we raised this alliance and what is the Climate Change Teaching Alliance in Taiwan, and also 3 more things, and then address final remark. And more and more extreme weather events cause significant impacts on Taiwan natural, ecological, environmental system, and also human economic and social systems. I believe this happen for all over the world. And you can see here, there's extreme rainfall happen in past maybe 7 or 8 years. You can see the year 2014 in May in Taichung, the maximum hourly rainfall is 90 millimeters, and 1 month later in Jiayi is 100 per hour, not per day or per year, it's per hour. And then you can see the 2015 in June in Taipei, our campus is 131.5 millimeter per hour. And then 2 years later, in the southern Taiwan in Pingtung is 181. You can see the design stone of a drain system for Taipei metropolitan area is 78.85, which means when the hourly rainfall is more than this value, then there's inundations. You can see the pictures. There's the MRT station nearby our campus. But this is not the end. You can see the year 2019 in Taichung increased to 99 millimeter per hour. Then in the same year in Taipei, nearby park, that is 136.5. So more and more extreme rainfall happen in Taiwan area. And on the other hand, you can see here, this is another crop field. This is bottom of a reservoir and happen right now. It's Ching-Pin Reservoir. Ching-Pin Reservoir is the largest reservoir in Taiwan. And you can see the bottom, the soil become very, very dry. So the dry condition is happening in Taiwan in this moment. And not only the human systems, but also the natural systems. You can see the interrupt stream. This is the upstream of Dajia Creek. In fact, this is very important habitat for Taiwan salmon. The upper picture, you can see the normal stream conditions. There are streams that flow over the channel, but sometimes the stream channel become interrupt streams. So this is very dangerous to the Taiwan salmon. Taiwan salmon is an endangered species in Taiwan. So you can see not only the human society, but also the ecosystems are seriously impacted by the extreme weather events in Taiwan. We all know climate change will result in a lot of extreme weather events, such as flood, drought, landslide, storm surge. So the human society and ecosystem face to the physical risks. In order to mitigate the climate change, a lot of regulation, for example, the European maybe collect the border tax, carbon tax in 2023. And this kind of regulation or new collection framework will result in transition risks to our industry and financial institutes. So both transition risks and fiscal risks are very, very significant impact on Taiwan societies. So in the past, we do the climate change research. We analyze the possible climate change and the climate change impacts. But right now, we not only awareness of climate, but also we need to take actions. When we want to take actions, then we need knowledge to support. The the report Adaptation Gap published in 2004 mentioned that the lack of systematic identification and analysis of adaptation knowledge gap. So we need to bridge this gap. And also the scientific evidence from different science, we need to make it available to decision makers at all levels, the central government, local government, industry, even the general public. That's the reason the Ministry of Education start to think about how can we strengthen the teaching capacity of the universities. Okay, so there are 9 disciplines in our project, including the water resources, disaster risk reductions, energy and industry, and also biodiversity, land use, and coastal road and infrastructures. So we have 9 disciplines in this alliance, and many different many professors in different disciplines to work on different disciplines. And in this alliance, we try to establish the capacity, including we prepare the teaching materials, including the practice materials, and we also design courses and the program for climate change. And also we training the instructors, and also we training the teaching assistants, because the graduate student always serve as the teaching assistants. But in fact, many of the students without any without any training on the climate change. So this alliance also provides some training course to training the teaching assistants. And we also establish a platform. This platform is to provide the teaching materials and also serve to exchange the experience, teaching experience exchange, and also the teaching resources sharing. And the goal and the contents of those course and the program we decide will include the core domain knowledge. Depends on what kind of sector they are working on, and also the measures or tools or process to do the climate risk assessment. And also we have a climate adaptation pathway, the material to teach how can we develop climate adaptation pathway, and also introduce some nowadays state-of-the-art innovative techniques. Also present some case study to the climate change risk assessment and adaptations. And also by the end of each part, we also try to mention that the cross-sector analysis is very important in the climate change studies. And the goal of this course is try to educate students to be able to assess, not only know the climate change, but also they can assess climate risks and also develop climate adaptation pathway to solve the problems. So they not only know the problem, but also can have the ability to solve the problems. And we want to build and enhance industry adaptability to climate change. And in each course, we have a main methodology. So we call it the climate adaptation algorithms. This algorithm consists of 3 major components. The first one is the climate adaptation 6 steps. We want the student to have a systematic thinking. They need to have identified problems and then assess the climate risk for current condition and future condition in the second and third steps, and then identify possible options in the 4th step. In the 5th step and 6th step are planning adaptation pathway and also develop monitoring and modification systems. This is the standard process we want to address in each sector's textbook materials. And to implement these 6 steps, we also develop a climate risk template. And this template tries to decompose the possible causes and factors to result in the climate risks. This one will help the teachers to guide the student to think about what the cause to the climate risks, including the hazard, exposure, and the sensitivities. And on the other side, we also develop the climate adaptation pathway. This one is try to put the adaptation option into schedules so we can have dynamic to adapt to the changing climate in futures. And in order to support the climate change programs and courses, we have developed a lot of textbooks and also practice for the 9 sectors. And we also try to establish some online course videos, and to including the video will briefly introduce the teaching materials and also introduce the models. And each segment of videos is 15 minutes. And a lot of videos have been established right now. And in order to have, because as I said, we want our course is not only establishing the knowledge of climate change, but also to train the student to have the ability to solve the problems. And the more aggressive, proactive concept is we want the student to establish maybe new business. So in our program, we also have climate change innovation competitions, which means students, after they have their course, they can propose their ideas to solve the certain problems. And the most better is they can establish some business for futures, so they can join the competitions. So this is our idea. For example, my course, I don't have any final exam. My final exam is a teamwork. They need to propose a business related to the climate change, and then the student will join these competitions. I think there's a new way in our education, not only just a professor to give a talk, student do the homework. We try to provoke students to think about how can they enable the society, and also can have new innovations on the business. And because of the climate change is a very significant impacts on different sectors. So we also mentioned to students, you need to think about the cross-sector analysis. So we try to have the different sector to work together to point out what kind of cross-sector problems are important, and how can we solve the cross-sector problems in our textbook. And there are 3 more things. After we have this climate change teaching alliance, we also think about how can we link to the education for sustainable development. So in our course, we also try to teach us to incorporate the contents of sustainable development, which means we teach students how can they assess the climate risks, how can they develop adaptation pathway to solve the problems, and finally to reach the sustainable development goals. So this kind of integration also include in our alliance teaching materials. And right now, not only for the university, but also for the corporations, the environmental, social environment are very important. So our alliance also linked to university social responsibilities. And in order to link to social responsibilities, we also integrate our material into the living lab. So we try to have our campus governance, the problems such as the water problem, energy problem of the campus, and then we have this problem, provide this problem or knowledge to the courses. Then students can work on these campus problems, and not only on the campus problems, they can extend this kind of knowledge to society through the university social responsibility projects. So I think I will give a final remark. The education is the most powerful weapons which can use to change our world. So when we face the big challenge of climate change, so education is very important. And I also want to raise the 3A, triple A. The sufficient awareness of transition and physical risks are very crucial. And also provide attitude to climate change need to be established to support actions. And the science-based, I think this is the most important, science-based actions on how carbon transitions and resilient adaptation are important to respond to climate change with uncertainties. So this is my talk.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Tong. Now we have about 4 or 5 minutes to have a Q&A, probably 1 or 2 questions. So you're welcome to submit your questions through the question bar. Currently, there is one question for Professor Tong. Do you have educational learning resources that we can use or modify so that we can integrate into our lessons in our schools? That's the first question for Professor Tong. Yeah.
This school is in Taiwan or in USA? In Taiwan, right? If it is in Taiwan, the answer is yes.
So. Yeah.
Yeah. Then yes. We have these materials are open to publics, but of course you need to register the account to the climate change platform, and then provide your request to what kind of material you want to download. Then you will give the admissions to download these materials. Yes, this material are available. Yep.
Okay, great. Are there any further questions from the audience? Okay, if not, because we have after the 2 speech, we will have a general Q&A session. So probably you can hold on the questions until then. Okay, so let's thank you, Professor Tong, for your wonderful speech.
Thank you.
So now can we, thank you. So can we move on? Yeah, okay. Yeah, now it's our, the second speaker, Ms. Michelle Wyman. Introduce Ms. Wyman a little bit. She served as the Executive Director of a Global Council for Science and the Environment. She has worked on clean energy, climate, and environmental policy with all levels of government for over 2 decades, developing strategic and tactical solutions for these areas. And she serves in a variety of advisory roles with domestic and international organizations to increase the recognition of and reliance on science in service to the environment and the society. Okay, so let's hand over to the presentation to Ms. Wyman. Let's welcome Ms. Wyman.
Thank you so much, Professor Ma. And also I wanted to first extend my thanks to the National Taiwan University, to the Global Environmental Education Partnership, JEEP, and to NAAEE, as well as, again, Professor Ma, Professor Tung, for your wonderful presentation. I look forward to our discussion at the end of mine. Also to Judy Browse from NAAEE, who leads JEEP. Thank you all. It's wonderful to spend a little bit of time with you for those of you attending, and I do want to encourage you to think about questions that you have. This is a lot of material that we're going to cover very quickly, and so I really do invite your questions and look forward to them. Next slide, please. A little bit about the Global Council for Science and the Environment, just so we can set the table on our conversation in the morning for those of you in Taiwan and for those of us here in the United States the evening. The mission of our organization is to improve the scientific basis of environmental decision making. And we heard this from Professor Tung a number of times, the importance of evidence-informed, knowledge-informed decisions. That is really the focus of our organization, and we'll talk further throughout the presentation about how we affect our work. As an international non-governmental organization, we're headquartered here in Washington, D.C. in the United States. We do work with universities, research institutes, governments at all levels, and industry sectors around the world. Next slide, please. I should mention that we are not a political or a partisan organization. I say that often And it will become more and more evident why during the course of my presentation. Clearly, climate change in the United States has a very complicated and long history around the politics of the science itself, and how the politics have influenced steady back and forth progress. And some would argue that progress is defined in different ways. For those people that understand, believe in, and support climate science, they would probably say that progress has not been swift enough. For those that do not agree with climate science and the research that supports the findings that the climate is changing, they might argue that progress is defined by not having policies that support climate action. So as we go through the presentation today, I'm going to try and give you a really strong picture of the policy history in the United States, from the national level down to the local level. But first, and I've left this slide up here for a minute, I won't read it to you, but really it does capture the core of why we do our work. At GCSE, we actively pursue opportunities to connect scientists with decision makers, not only in times of urgency when an extreme weather event or climate event is occurred, like a hurricane or a wildfire, but to facilitate those connections. We call ourselves boundary spanners, to connect scientists and decision makers in between the times of crisis. So when extreme climate events occur, these relationships are already in place, understanding that local scientists often are the key to helping both inform the response to extreme weather and climate events, and also to study the impacts, and there are always new findings, and then finally also to help inform the rebuilding process on the back end of extreme events. But the process of engaging scientists and decision makers is a careful process that requires time and it requires support. And that is, again, really the work that we do. Next slide, please. So to really start at the highest level beyond the United States, and just to set the table for our discussion, from a global climate policy lens, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997, and it was really the first mechanism that existed for those countries that are members of the United Nations to engage together and recognize that climate change was occurring. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, was established, and through the Kyoto Protocol, the targets and the actions that were put forth by the UNFCCC were then operationalized. Several years later, I believe in 2005, the Kyoto Protocol was actually brought into law by those countries that had ratified, that had signed the Kyoto Protocol. The United States did not sign the Kyoto Protocol. It wasn't until the Paris Agreement was brought forward in 2015, where 195 nations came together, including the United States, and they all committed, renewed their commitments, and also increased their commitments to effectively addressing climate change and in mitigating in country those actions that were rapidly increasing the overall global portfolio of greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. I think what's important to hold is, from a global perspective, every country, Taiwan has its own context around its history and globally around climate policy, and certainly the United States has a complicated history that is really affected by and influenced by the person who is the current president. Under President Obama, the United States actively participated in and then signed on to the Paris Agreement. Under the previous administration, President Trump, he immediately, within the first 100 days, removed the United States from the Paris Agreement. And our current president, President Obama, on his first day in office, actually returned the United States to the Paris Agreement, and we signed once more. So again, the history that we have as a global stakeholder and a nation that does aim to be a global leader from a science diplomacy perspective, it's been a very complicated history. I anticipate that that history will continue to be complicated. It doesn't mean that progress isn't happening, however. So let's talk a little bit about what happened just in the last 4 months here in the United States. When President Biden was voted into office and he took his position, on day one, he immediately passed an executive order that committed an all of government and a whole of society approach to protecting public health, to restoring climate science and scientific integrity. And he also committed to revoking a permit for a really contested new primary transnational pipeline carrying natural gas. And he's additionally proposed a $2 trillion jobs plan. What's really interesting about this particular proposal is the jobs plan contains an array of strong climate investments that help accelerate from a policy lens and also from a financial lens through federal investments from the government that accelerate the ability of the United States and then trickling down to states within the US to begin to not only invest in, but prepare for the clean energy future. Understanding from a domestic lens that we as a country are keen to step back into a leadership role, not only as a strong climate actor, but also as a competitive global entity. And we view, and certainly this president views, and when I say we, I mean the climate science community, a lot of opportunity, as much opportunity that climate investments and climate actions represent as risk for inaction. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. President Biden also, he hosted on Earth Day, a summit of world leaders. And those world leaders, they kicked off the summit by spending the first 2 hours with every participating leader, announcing new and accelerated commitments to effectively mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, something else that I wanted to share with you all that I think is extraordinary. President Biden has established the first ever Environmental Justice Advisory Council and really committed to investing in disadvantaged communities, those communities that are disproportionately affected by climate impacts. And there is a reference that the administration is using called Justice 40. And this reference really represents what I have here on the slide, that at least 40% of all benefits and all federal spending is committed to disadvantaged communities in the context of climate impacts. But the Justice 40 concept also applies across everything from federal hiring practices and other policy sets. So it's a really progressive agenda that President Biden has put forward. Next slide, please. And now there is the reality, and we begin to get into the complexity of policy history here in the United States. So take a look at this slide. These different years that I've identified for you all are, they list primary pieces of legislation, bills that have been introduced. They were never actually enacted. They weren't passed. Since 2003, bills that have been introduced by different congressional members, both in the House and in the Senate, pushing hard, trying to establish national climate policy. None of these have passed. None of them. Not the McCain-Lieberman Climate Stewardship Act that tried not once but twice to get passed, with extraordinary effort by bipartisan bill sponsors, did not pass. The 2007 Global Warming Pollution Act didn't pass. 2013, 2 bills did not pass. 2009, the Clean Energy and Security Act also didn't pass. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. In 1970, the United States passed something called the Clean Air Act, and it has been one of the most durable pieces of national legislation in U.S. history. Embedded in the Clean Air Act is a very specific law, and that language was actually engaged to support treating greenhouse gases the way we currently treat other types of criteria air pollutants. And the argument legally was that the greenhouse gases pose as much risk to public health as the criteria air pollutants do. And this was initially contested. It was brought forward in court. There were lawsuits. It got hung up for quite some time. Ultimately, however, the courts agreed that the strength of the Clean Air Act and this particular part of the law could be upheld. And with that, rather than trying to go through Congress to have policies and regulatory frameworks to effectively fight climate change, particularly from those sectors that are high emitters, the Clean Air Act has become the strongest regulatory mechanism for the United States to have any way of effectively addressing at least high emitting polluters. So that was a really, really big groundbreaking and positive breakthrough for the climate science community, for the climate policy community that have been pushing for many years to effectively have some mechanism to reinforce the importance of strong positive climate action. Next slide, please. So now briefly, I want to talk with you all. I don't have a slide on subnational action, but I do want to talk with you briefly about how these climate policies, including the Clean Air Act, how do these different national and federal level pieces of policy trickle down through our states and ultimately to our local governments, our cities, our counties, our townships. How does all of that engage? Because certainly here in the US, we have a strong history of climate action at the state level, not by all states, but generally at any given point in time. In the last 15 years, we've had pretty consistent strong action by at least a third of the states in the US, and usually closer to half of the states in the US. Now, it's worth noting that there is generally also a pretty strong balance of Republican and Democratic governorships. And when there isn't a balance, then the state houses, the state legislatures generally do carry the balance, even if there are more Republican governors than Democratic governors or vice versa. And those are our two primary political parties. And at the state level, a lot of, sorry, I was just making sure that no one was texting me to say my sound was off or anything, so I'll keep going. At the state level, there have been some really effective policy mechanisms in place that have helped reinforce upstream, and we'll see that reflected now in the coming 3.5 years under this administration. They've already been leaning hard into some of the data sets and the outputs of strong state level policies that have helped accelerate reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from the transportation sector and from the building sector. We don't have a lot of time to go into that, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Certainly strong building codes in the commercial sector and also fuel standards in the transportation sector have been two of the primary mechanisms that have helped accelerate strong reductions across states. And for those states that have enacted policies and regulations to enforce those. At the local government level, it gets really interesting. Back in I believe it was 2004, there was one single mayor who established the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. And the motivation behind that agreement was specifically the fact that the United States had not signed on to, had not ratified the Kyoto Protocol after years of back and forth and wanting to. And so this particular mayor, he was Mayor Greg Nichols, who's the mayor of the city of Seattle in Washington State. He decided to essentially emulate the Kyoto Protocol for mayors to sign. And so the targets that were set forth in this local government agreement were the equivalent targets that were called out in the Kyoto Protocol that would have been applicable to the United States had the United States ratified. And Mayor Nichols, with the help of a lot of organizations, then began pushing other mayors to also sign on to those commitments. And over a period of about 4 years, there are now more than 2,000 mayors from cities of all sizes who have signed on to the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. And this has enabled them locally to share knowledge, to share best practices, to share draft policies. It has also really, it was the beginning of shining a light on the importance and the strength of local action, recognizing that most local governments carry a tremendous level of authority and responsibility around those specific sectors, and also the behaviors of their citizens. They can't regulate behavior, but they can encourage behavior. They can lead by example. And they sit in positions of influence that have been really well recognized now since the 2004 agreement was initiated. Not only in the US, but it was really the beginning of a groundswell, and there was uptake around the world. There are now a number of different organizations that work with major cities, mega cities around the world, kind of bypassing national barriers, state level or regional level barriers, and just going directly to the governing bodies overseeing major cities to work on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving public health, and improving economic development and sustainability. So the subnational history around climate policy in the United States is generally much more cohesive and more consistent than our national policy history has been on climate. What I wanted to focus on briefly here is what really occurred in our education system, our public education system, that started to swing the bell towards a strong value for climate education. And these are the National Generation Science Standards. And the reason I wanted to bring this up with all of you, I think this is really, really interesting. The National Generation Science Standards, they were released in 2013. They were developed by a cohort of the National Academies of Science, and then a number of science societies, like the American Geophysical Union, that might be familiar to some of you, the Association for the Advancement, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, as well as large groups of educators from across the United States. And these science standards were really co-created and co-designed to renew and establish, to renew a commitment to teaching science from from kindergarten all the way through the 12th grade of high school. And the reason I raise these in the context of this presentation, it was really a breakthrough moment in climate education when the Next Generation Science Standards were released, because that served as the mechanism to grow awareness around the importance of teaching climate science, both teaching the science to students, but also ensuring that educators were trained and ready to teach about climate change, to teach the science behind climate change. And to give you a data point, Before the next generation science standards were released, less than 1% of science content in K through 12 public schools in the United States, less than 1%, had any references to climate change and climate science. After the standards were released in 2013, that grew almost overnight within a couple of years by 30%. In the next webinar, you're going to learn a lot more detail about where we are today around climate education and where we want to be, recognizing that there is an appetite for climate science for students at all levels, beginning with the earliest grades all the way up through high school, and also recognizing that we are educating the future generation that will be taking on the clean energy economy, and certainly needs to be grounded in climate science in order to be prepared and to be ready to take on the opportunities. Next slide, please. So briefly, again, I highlight this because you can see the complicated quilt. And I mentioned earlier, roughly we always have somewhere around half of our states working progressively on climate action, and we have roughly half of our states not doing so directly and indirectly. And climate science goes hand in hand with many other science disciplines in this country. And you can see here that currently 20 states and the District of Columbia have fully adopted next generation science standards. Now, many additional states are also utilizing them, they reference them, they engage them, but only 20 states and the District of Columbia have actually formally adopted them. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight, and this, I'm moving towards the end of my presentation, I wanted to highlight a research report that we published through GCSE in 2019. And this particular report took the largest public research university in every state, and we applied the same research questions focused on climate education, climate research, and what we really wanted to determine was, do the politics of the state influence the level of activity happening within the largest public research university in that same state? And if you'll go to the next slide, please. What we determined is the answer is remarkably no. The politics of a state do not affect the level of activity. We saw a relatively strong level of activity across states. Now, bear in mind, these numbers vary greatly based on how many papers have been published. However, the population of these different states is also very different. The size of the research institute is very directly aligned to the population of the state. So generally speaking, on average, we determined that the level of climate research taking place in public institutions was consistent across the board. And we also determined that most of the research taking place was place-based. So remember at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that we focus a lot on connecting decision makers to scientists. A lot of that connectivity happens locally. If we know that climate research is primarily place-based, not always, but much of it is, there is so much incentive to connect local decision makers, mayors, county executives, councils, to local climate scientists, so they can work consistently over time, not only during periods of crisis, to prepare for climate change, which is already underway. And I'll go very quickly through these next slides. Some of them are cut off, so I just wanted to highlight the various stakeholders that we work with, primarily universities and research institutes, but also government at all levels and different sectors. Next slide. I also wanted to highlight an opportunity. I hope that National Taiwan University might consider, and we would love to count Taiwan among our community. You can see here we do not yet have a university from Taiwan, so we hope to be able to work with you more directly in future. And then the last slide is to invite all of you to our conference in March of 2022. For students, it is completely free, and we would really welcome having your attendance and your participation. The theme of the conference is actually focused on positive climate thresholds and the tipping points and the domino effects that begin to occur in a positive direction when strong investments, policy, financial, leadership, and actual technology applications are made to help turn the curve away from increasing greenhouse gas emissions towards mitigating them effectively, and then beginning to see the domino effect that occurs on the positive side in the improvements of public health, stabilizing economies from local all the way up through national, and also growing the sustainability of the places where we live. So I'll pause there and welcome any questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, for your wonderful speech regarding the science-informed climate education program in the U.S. Okay, so because of time, let's probably move on to the general Q&A session, in which we have about probably 7 minutes, if okay with you. Okay, so we got the first questions. First question for Professor Tung. Okay, it is from I think it is Scott. I'm impressed with how Professor Tung is challenging students to identify ways to pursue climate action through new businesses. So what are some challenges they have faced doing that, and can give some good examples of what students have done? Professor Tung.
Okay. I think our students all have very good ideas, but also the measures to solve the problems, but they don't have any background knowledge to how can they establish the business or deliver their knowledge to the clients. So we have some also for the competition programs. We also have some training workshop for those students. They submit their proposal to the competitions. Then we train them how can they develop their business plan, or how can they identify their target client, target audience. I think the summarize my my ideas is the most weakness for students is how can they deliver their service or their solutions to the target audience. Yeah, but we do provide some workshop for them to solve their problems.
Great, thank you, Professor Tung. And the second question for Michelle, it is from, I think, I know who is from Tsinghua-U.S. Professor Gao in Taiwan. So in the climate change education course, students are usually more willing to learn fact and science. In Taiwan, the students in climate change courses are usually not very enthusiastic when the teachers are sharing very general policy framework and climate laws. How about the situation in the US? And do you have any teaching method to improve such situation? Michelle?
Thank you so much for the good question. It really depends on the level. Certainly in high school, in 9 through 12, there's a much more sophisticated approach to teaching climate science, but really the science is separate from policy classes and from law classes. Usually it isn't until the university that, and still really focused in the social sciences, that the tensions that exist between teaching climate science and then understanding how that science informs decision making, it really doesn't occur here in the United States until university level classes. As far as materials or resources, I can share some with our hosts and then they can share some of those links with you.
Great. Okay. And now there's a question I think both of you can respond to. It is from, I think it is Mr. Go. Thank you for holding this workshop. We all know that it can be only the science teacher's responsibilities to teach climate change in school. So do you have any suggestions for teachers who are teaching general arts or languages in terms of teaching climate change in class? Professor Tung, would you go first?
Yeah, I think not, as I said, right now the climate change is not only the science, but also the actions. So I think the best way for a teacher to teach their course is how can they link their teaching materials to real problem in our societies, and also let students learn the skill to analyze the problems and then provoke their thinkings to try to provide measures to solve the problems. So even though those students don't have the strong domain knowledge to solve problems, but also they can know what kind of problems they are faced and what kind of knowledge they need to learn in the futures. Yeah, that's my comments. Yeah.
Great. Michelle?
Yeah, you know, actually, here in the U.S., it was just last year that the state of New Jersey was the first state to require climate change education across all levels of primary ed, K through 12. And they really require it across all disciplines. And we hope that that is only the beginning of the shift that we are going to see. I would say as far as practical application, we are really big supporters of workshopping, taking the science, going outside, and showing by doing how to apply that science in a real life context. And I think, Professor Tung, you also just said the same thing. And over here, that is very much how we do that from a social science lens, in art classes, and far beyond the lab.
Okay, great. Probably the last question. How do you teach climate change for learners with disabilities or learners from impoverished areas? Okay, so I think that's an important question. Professor Tong or Michelle, would you like to respond to this question?
Could you say the question again? I'm quite understand. You mean?
Okay. Yeah, I think for learners with disabilities or learners from impoverished areas, from poor areas. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the climate change will influence all peoples, especially the disability or the society, the poor society may be more vulnerable to climate change. So that's the reason we may need some social resources to help them. I think that's the reason in our university, the National Taiwan University, we try to have the university social responsibility project and work with the cooperate social responsibility projects. And we also try to have our effort, not only the domain knowledge materials, but also we have some money sources to help these people have a good way to learn the climate change and have a good assistance to help them to solve the problems. So I think the social resources is also very important for this this kind of peoples. Yes.
Okay. Michelle, would you like to share a few thoughts?
Yeah, no, just briefly. I think actually the teaching techniques for those students that are differently abled and also coming from underserved or underrepresented communities is particularly challenging. I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation the focus and the priority by this administration on frontline communities and disproportionately affected communities. And certainly the educators in those places are taking on the priority of teaching climate change and climate impacts so that they can be understood by those students that are underserved and again are at greater risk than students who are in more privileged situations.
Okay, great. Okay, because of time, probably we should wrap up this session. We can see that both in the US and Taiwan, we are laying the foundation to incorporate climate education into various disciplines so that we can empower this generation to embark on a transformation journey to sustainability. So before we leave this session, I'd like to announce the session 2, next session, which is empowering climate action through education. Okay, and the time, and then all the ladies and gentlemen from the audience, please notice that the time is in Taiwan is May 27th in the evening from 9 to 10 p.m. And in the US, and the US Eastern Time is May 27th from 9 to 10 a.m. in the morning. Okay, and also you will receive an email, okay, from the organizing body about the event survey. So we would appreciate if you could respond to the survey. Okay. Thank you all for your participation and enthusiastic discussion. Thank you, and I'll see you on May 27th.
Thank you.
Back to Melissa. Okay. Thank you.